My name is Ben Burgis. I'm the author of Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left, and also one of the co-authors of Myth and Mayhem, a leftist critique of Jordan Peterson, both of which are available from Zer0 Books. I should mention that Myth and Mayhem was co-authored by Conrad Hamilton, Matt McManus, and Marion Trejo, and there's also an introduction by Slavoj Žižek. All right. What I want to talk about today is not Jordan Peterson, but someone several miles to his right, which is Stefan Molyneux. As regular Zer0 Books YouTube viewers may remember, a little over a year ago, Molyneux blocked me on Twitter for pointing out that in his book about arguments, he got the definitions of validity and soundness wrong. Validity has to do with when the conclusion of an argument follows from the premises, and soundness is a valid argument also having true premises. And it's a pretty basic distinction. It's literally something that you learn on the first day of a university course on logic. And I thought, hey, if you're going to write a book about arguments, maybe this is something you could look into, flip through a few logic textbooks, get the basics right. So I gave him a little bit of a hard time about it on Twitter. He blocked me. And immediately afterwards, my editor, Doug Lane, issued a debate challenge on my behalf. And he ignored it for about a year. And then about a month ago, he said, oh, all right, actually, let's do it. So I had a debate with Stefan Molyneux. Some people who are extremely bad at math think that this is bad because I'm platforming Molyneux. Hint, Molyneux already has a platform that's much bigger than this one. But in any case, it was an interesting debate, and I want to talk today about two things that came up at that debate. The first one has to do with something he likes to say, the way that he sort of sold his moral and political philosophy, which is mostly libertarianism. There are some weird inconsistencies there we'll talk about later, but it's mostly libertarianism in his opening statement of the debate. Let's take a look.
Simply eliminate all of the hypocrisies, all of the contradictions in our absolute moral rules, our general moral rules, and we live out the dream of kindergarten. It sounds like an odd way to put it, but what if we simply said, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not rape, thou shalt not assault? What if we simply take that and make that our universal standard for humankind? Well, I believe that morality, like physics, only gains its true power when it is truly universalized. And for that, we must negotiate with each other. We must accept the reality of human evil and human corruption through power and eliminate the state as the great temptation to corrupt human beings and undo civilization. Because what is civilization? Civilization is the commitment to use reason rather than force. And the state, as an agency of force, is that which holds us back and drags us down to the apes. And that is my introduction.
All right. So he thinks that the right moral principles need to be ones that would be understood by kindergartners, or they line up with what kindergartners believe, maybe. I don't know how much time Stefan has spent around kindergartners, but they all seem pretty fixated on fairness in the distribution of goods. I'm fairly sure that the average kindergartner, if they see that another kindergartner has been given 2 cookies and they've only gotten 1, will be fairly upset by that. So this might not line up with Stefan's ideas quite as well as he thinks they will, but let's ignore that and talk about the larger point. Why should we want to have the morality of kindergartners? There are some important moral concepts that kindergartners can understand, but what about cases where different values come into conflict with one another, and you have to engage in some sort of trade-off to figure out what the right thing to do is? In other words, when ethicists talk about trade-offs, what they mean is weighing competing values against each other to see which takes precedence in a given situation. So think, for example, about abortion rights. People with a so-called pro-life position who are opposed to abortion rights will often argue that a fetus at the time of abortion counts as a full-fledged person, or the right sort of entity to have all the rights of a person. And of course, that's pretty dubious. One would think that consciousness, right, the ability to have experiences, is a pretty basic, necessary condition. Surely not a sufficient one, but a necessary condition for personhood. Most fetuses, given the stage of pregnancy at which most abortions take place, almost certainly don't cross that threshold. But let's assume for the sake of argument they do. Okay. So, does it follow that abortion is wrong? What does follow from this? Well, if we accepted this premise, and again, we shouldn't accept it in terms of what we actually believe, but if we accept this for the sake of argument, nothing actually follows about abortion immediately, because now we have two values that are in conflict with each other. On the one hand, there's the right of an innocent person to life, and on the other hand, there is the pregnant woman's right to bodily autonomy. Bodily autonomy is an extremely important value. So Stefan Molyneux, for example, is extremely fond of rape metaphors. And, of course, bodily autonomy is the very thing that's being violated in rape. So that matters a lot. So if right to life and right to bodily autonomy are, for the sake of argument, in tension here, what do we do? Well, for what I think is a very well worked out idea of what we should do, I would recommend Judith Jarvis Thompson's classic article in defense of abortion, which uses some thought experiments to kind of think through how we should think about possible clashes between the right to life and right to bodily autonomy. And she makes a fairly persuasive case, or at least I've always found it persuasive, that bodily autonomy can, at least in some situations, outweigh even the right to life. But whatever you make of that, to figure out the right thing to do in that hypothetical, you have to engage in some adult-level moral reasoning, right? In other words, you have to actually carefully think through a bunch of arguments about how to handle competing moral considerations. You can't just take a single principle that would be comprehensible to kindergartners and barrel through, because there are multiple things going on here that are morally important that you actually need to do some reasoning. In fact, Stefan Molyneux seems to believe that there are such conflicts sometimes, although his main strategy is to simply ignore the contradictions. So an obvious case of this occurs with his views on immigration. So if Stefan were a standard, or at least a consistent libertarian, a lot of American libertarians are extremely inconsistent about this stuff. But if he were a consistent libertarian, he would agree, for example, with the libertarian philosopher Jason Brennan, somebody about whom I have nothing good to say except that he is consistent, who says that immigration restrictions are among the most blatant violations of the libertarians' non-aggression principle. That because after all, you have market transactions that the state is getting in the way of. So, for example, if person A currently lives in Mexico and person B is an employer or a landlord who wants to make a contract with person A to give him a job or rent out an apartment to him. And so person A is moving from place to place to take the job or, take the apartment. According to free market libertarian principles, that should be sacrosanct. The state absolutely has no business interfering with it. And, just the idea that armed agents of the state are going to go out and track people down and throw them in cages for moving from the territory of one state to the other without violating anybody's private property rights is a really obvious violation of libertarian principles. It's also a problem based on more reasonable principles to certainly have the kind of harsh and punitive immigration policies that have been enacted by the Trump administration. But, there is an obvious case to be made that, peaceful people not bringing in diseases, et cetera, should be allowed to move around as they please, that, you don't have to be a free market libertarian to make, right? Plenty of socialists would agree with that. But certainly if you're a free market libertarian, this is just straightforwardly entailed by your political philosophy. So let's talk about how Stefan tries to get around it. He makes these analogies, for example, about, if you're a landlord, you don't have to rent out your property to anybody, and he analogizes that to the state deciding not to let people move into its territory. But of course, that only works if you think that the state owns, as its private property, the whole country, which not only wouldn't get you free market libertarianism, it would get you totalitarianism if you actually believed that. Stefan has tried to get around this by saying that, actually, so it's not that he thinks the state owns the country, right? When I brought this up later on Twitter, this was his defense. He unblocked me eventually. He may have blocked me again, but, he unblocked me for the duration of this thing leading up to the debate and after. So that it's not that he's saying that the state owns the country. No. What he's saying is the taxpayers own the country. So if the majority of taxpayers support more restrictive immigration policies, then that's good enough, right? Because then the taxpayers own the whole country and can do with it what they want, including interfering in voluntary market transactions between American employers and Mexican would-be employees. Okay, but of course this might not get you Stalinism, like the principle that the state owns the whole country, but it does sound like it means that any time, not a majority, right? There are poll taxes here, but a majority of taxpayers support some policy. It doesn't matter if that policy violates free market libertarian principles. Really? Because I'm fairly sure a majority of British taxpayers support the NHS. A majority of Canadian taxpayers support Canada's single-payer healthcare program. So Stefan thinks that there's no legitimate libertarian free market objection to be made to those because the taxpayers support them. This obviously isn't going to plug up this massive gaping consistency hole in his views either. And at a certain point, you might start to suspect that something else is going on with him being a libertarian about everything except for immigration. And I believe there is some evidence, if you look at some of his other videos, that there might be something else going on. For example,
go to Poland. What is it, 99% white? I don't need any security. The streets are incredibly clean. Crime is almost non-existent. Nobody gets called a racist. There's no talk of white privilege. No identity politics. No endless diversity nagging. You know, I've spoken against white nationalism, but I'm an empiricist. I'm an empiricist.
Yeah. But strangely, he doesn't, in our debate, he didn't bring up those sorts of considerations, that, you know, an ethno-state might not be so bad. In fact, he tried to duck the immigration issue the first few times that I brought it up in the debate, but we did eventually get into it. And his final strategy as the debate was progressing towards the end, when I pointed out some of these things to him about the obvious inconsistency in his views, was to just kind of give up on libertarian principles and start talking like a utilitarian who thinks that sufficiently good consequences can be enough to make any violation of free market libertarian principles worth it. So we'll close on that point and watch what he said about this, the benefits in his view of restricted immigration, and what my response to it was.
Gotta ask you, where's your heart? I mean, good heavens, the blacks in America have suffered so enormously under slavery, under Jim Crow, under segregation. They were just beginning to pick themselves up and start to join the middle class enormously after the end of the 1950s and into the 1960s. Then the welfare state came and eviscerated. The single mother welfare state came along and eviscerated the black family, which just got trashed. And then mass immigration came in and ground them into the dust when it came to just being able to earn money and support their families. I mean, it's just been absolutely brutal. And doesn't America have a special obligation to the blacks in America to ensure that they have as great a future as humanly possible, rather than pouring all the money into supporting every other culture, language, race, and religion that wants to come into America and drive down the wages of the most vulnerable, the most persecuted, the most ground down group in American history, are further being ground down by the left's greed for free and easy votes. And I think it's absolutely unconscionable.
We heard a few things to try to paper over the obvious contradiction between Stefan's free market libertarianism and the idea that it's legitimate for the state to get in the way of free market interactions between landlords or employers who want to employ people or give them housing who are currently in other countries, and those people accepted those offers. One was this business about how people are going to vote for left-wing politicians or accept welfare services. And if the mere fact that members of some group are more likely to do these things is a good enough reason to restrict their rights, then there's no particular reason, unless you hold the premise that the state has a moral right to do whatever they want with the country they own, which would give you the opposite of anarcho-capitalism. Unless you accept that premise, those two things can't fit together. And I was even more surprised when he started using these consequentialist arguments about how third world nations are disadvantaged because the best and the brightest leave, so that's a good enough reason to violently stop them from coming here, or about how third world immigration is supposedly bad for African Americans in terms of economic consequences. Because if Stefan really thought that it was okay to violate property rights, anytime violating property rights had good consequences for Black people in America or for people in the developing world, then he and I would disagree on far less than we actually do.
Well, thanks. Appreciate the conversation. And thanks everyone for watching.
Thanks for watching this Zer0 Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zer0 Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zer0 Books book club and help us to continue making online content from the left.